31 doctors couldn't diagnose the billionaire's disease until a maid's toddler asked one question. The morning light filtered through floor-to-ceiling windows of the Harrington estate, casting long golden ribbons across Italian marble floors that cost more per square foot than most Americans earned in a month. The estate sat on 42 pristine acres in Greenwich, Connecticut, a monument to everything that 33-year-old Ethan Harrington had built, or more accurately, had inherited, expanded, and transformed into an empire that stretched across 11 countries and generated more revenue before noon than some small nations did in a year. Ethan stood at his bedroom window, dressed in a custom-tailored shirt that remained untucked, staring at the manicured gardens below with eyes that had lost their spark. He was, by every measurable standard that the modern world cared about, extraordinary. Forbes had placed him on their cover 3 times. Time magazine called him the architect of tomorrow. His philanthropic foundation had built schools in Ghana, funded clean water projects in rural India, and provided scholarships to over 4,000 first-generation college students across America. But none of that mattered this morning. None of it had mattered for the past 14 months. The tremors had started small, a slight shake in his right hand when he reached for his coffee mug, something he'd initially dismissed as too much caffeine and not enough sleep. Then came the fatigue, the kind that settled into his bones like concrete, making even the simple act of climbing his grand staircase feel like summiting Everest. Then the headaches, sharp and relentless, arriving without warning and departing on their own schedule, indifferent to the arsenal of medications his physicians prescribed. Then the episodes, brief, terrifying moments where his vision would fracture at the edges, where the world would tilt sideways, where words would dissolve on his tongue before he could speak them. 31 doctors. That was the count his personal assistant Margaret had kept in a leather-bound notebook with the same meticulous care she applied to his board meeting schedules. 31 physicians across 4 countries, including 3 who were considered the finest neurologists in the world, 2 specialists who had treated heads of state, and 1 elderly doctor from Switzerland whom billionaires flew in privately when all other options had been exhausted. They had subjected Ethan to MRIs, PET scans, spinal taps, blood panels that tested for hundreds of rare conditions, genetic sequencing, sleep studies, and procedures that had no common names, only long Latin phrases that Margaret dutifully copied into her notebook. The verdict, every single time, was the same devastating non-answer. We cannot find a definitive cause. Some had offered theories. One said it might be early-onset Parkinson's, though the presentation was atypical. Another suggested a rare autoimmune condition attacking his nervous system. A third had hypothesized psychosomatic manifestation of extreme stress, a diagnosis Ethan had thrown back across the consultation table with barely contained fury. He was not imagining this. He was not stressed into trembling. Something was wrong with him, genuinely physiologically wrong, and the finest medical minds money could access were failing him completely. He had $4.7 billion. He could purchase hospitals. He could fund entire research departments. He could fly anywhere in the world on a moment's notice, sleep in suites that cost more per night than a year of his housekeeper's salary, and access corridors of influence that ordinary people didn't even know existed. And yet he was dying, or at least deteriorating, and nobody could tell him why. The door to his bedroom suite opened quietly, and Margaret appeared with his morning schedule printed on cream-colored paper. At 61, Margaret had worked for the Harrington family for over 3 decades, first for Ethan's father and then for Ethan himself. She was sturdy, silver-haired, and possessed the rare gift of reading Ethan's moods with the precision of a barometer. "You didn't sleep again," she said. It wasn't a question. "What's first?" he asked, ignoring the observation. "Dr. Patel from Johns Hopkins is calling at 9. The board meeting has been pushed to 11. And," she paused, glancing at a separate note in her hand. "Rosa called. Her regular childcare has a family emergency. She's asking if she can bring Lily today. She says she completely understands if it's not appropriate and will find another arrangement, but I wanted to ask you first." Rosa Mendez had been cleaning the Harrington estate 3 days a week for nearly 2 years. She was 28 years old, quiet and thorough, with dark eyes that noticed things, a smudge on the baseboard that everyone else stepped over, a vase placed slightly off-center, a window that hadn't been cleaned to its full potential. She took pride in her work with a dignity that Ethan had privately always respected, even if he'd rarely found the words to express it. Her daughter Lily was 3 years old. Ethan had seen her exactly twice, once in passing when Rosa had briefly introduced her during a school holiday, and once through the window when Rosa was leaving and Lily had been waiting in the car, pressed against the glass, watching the enormous house with enormous eyes. "Tell her it's fine," Ethan said, turning back to the window. He didn't think much of it. Children played. Life continued around his disintegration. What did it matter if a toddler wandered the downstairs while her mother cleaned? He had bigger things to occupy his crumbling attention. What he could not have known, standing at that window with all his billions and all his despair, was that today would be the day everything changed. Not because of Dr. Patel from Johns Hopkins. Not because of the 6-inch thick medical file sitting on his desk. Not because of any of the magnificent machinery of modern medicine that he had deployed against this invisible enemy consuming him. Today would change because a 3-year-old girl named Lily Mendez, who owned no degrees, no credentials, no understanding of biochemistry or neurology, who had spent her brief life in a small apartment in Bridgeport watching cartoons and collecting smooth rocks from the sidewalk, would ask one single question. A question that would stop time. A question so simple, so devastatingly obvious in hindsight, that Ethan Harrington would later say, in the speech he gave to 300 physicians at a medical conference, that he heard it and felt the answer arrive in his chest before his brain had even fully processed the words. But that moment was still hours away. For now, the sun continued its patient climb over the Harrington estate. Rosa Mendez was buckling her daughter into a car seat in Bridgeport, singing a soft song in Spanish, kissing the top of Lily's head. Lily was holding her favorite smooth gray rock in her small fist, completely unaware that she was being driven toward a moment that would alter the course of a stranger's life. And Ethan Harrington stood at his window, watching his gardens, feeling his right hand tremble against the cold glass, waiting, though he didn't know it yet, to be saved by the one person nobody would ever have thought to ask. Rosa Mendez had learned early that invisibility was both a survival skill and a wound. She had grown up in a household that demanded silence. Her father, a construction worker with calloused hands and a tender heart buried beneath years of exhaustion, had taught her through example rather than words that people like them moved through the world quietly, efficiently, without demanding to be seen. They showed up. They did the work. They went home. Dignity lived not in recognition but in the quality of what you left behind. A clean surface, a completed job, a child fed and loved and put to bed with a story. Her mother had cleaned houses in Bridgeport for 20 years before her knees had given out. Rosa had started helping her at 14, spending weekends learning the precise choreography of someone else's home, which surfaces needed gentle treatment, which required firm attention, how to move through rooms without disturbing their particular silence, how to make a space better without leaving evidence of yourself behind. It was work that some people looked through rather than at. She had long since made her peace with that. But cleaning the Harrington estate had always felt different, though she couldn't entirely explain why. Partly, it was the scale, the sheer cathedral-like quality of those rooms, the way sound moved differently through 42 acres of manicured perfection, the way sunlight entered those floor-to-ceiling windows and transformed everything it touched into something almost holy. But mostly, if she was being truthful with herself in the quiet moments, it was because of Ethan Harrington himself. Not in the way people might assume. Rosa was not naive, and she had long ago developed finely tuned radar for men who conflated proximity with possibility. Ethan had never given her a moment's reason for that particular vigilance. In fact, what had struck her from their first meeting was how genuinely, almost painfully, lost he seemed beneath all that polish. She had cleaned homes for people who had forgotten they were people, who had calcified into their net worth, who looked at service workers the way they looked at furniture. Ethan was not that. He was something rarer and sadder. A man who still knew how to see people, who just didn't quite know how to reach them anymore. She had noticed the changes over the past year the way she noticed everything, quietly, without comment, cataloging what she observed with the trained attention of someone whose livelihood depended on seeing clearly. The untouched breakfast trays. The medication bottles accumulating on his bathroom counter, more each month, a pharmaceutical escalation that told its own story. The slight drag in his right leg that appeared on his bad days. The way he sometimes stood in a doorway for a moment too long, as if he'd forgotten where he was going, then recovered and continued with the seamless performance of normalcy that rich people were so expertly trained in. She had said nothing because it wasn't her place, and because she suspected he wouldn't want her to. This morning, she arrived at 8:15, earlier than usual, Lily balanced on her hip with the car seat carrier looped over her opposite arm. The morning was cold and clean, the kind of late autumn day that made Connecticut look like a painting of itself. Lily was wearing her purple coat, her favorite, the one with the hood shaped like a bear, and was clutching her smooth gray rock with the focused intensity of someone transporting something precious. "Remember what we talked about?" Rosa said softly as she approached the service entrance. Lily looked at her with those enormous dark eyes. Rosa's eyes. Everyone always said, though Lily's held a particular quality of unclouded attention that Rosa suspected was entirely her own. "Quiet and gentle," Lily said solemnly. "Quiet and gentle," Rosa confirmed, kissing her cheek. Margaret met them at the door with warm efficiency, showing Lily the small sitting room off the kitchen where a basket of toys had been quietly assembled. Someone, Rosa realized with a small ache in her chest, had actually gone out and purchased child-appropriate toys, or had them delivered, because the Harrington estate was not a home that had previously needed such things. She didn't know whether it had been Margaret's initiative or Ethan's, and she told herself it didn't matter. She got to work. The estate had its rhythms, and Rosa moved within them like water finding its natural course. The guest bathrooms first, then the formal dining room, the library, working her way gradually toward the more inhabited zones of the house. She worked with her earbuds out today. She always did when Lily was present, wanting to maintain awareness of her daughter, so she caught more than usual of the household sounds around her. A phone call in what she thought was Ethan's study, his voice low and controlled in the way people spoke when they were working hard not to sound afraid. The particular silence that followed. The muffled rhythm of his footsteps on the floor above. Around 9:30, Lily appeared in the doorway of the dining room, still holding her rock. "Mama," she said. Rosa looked up from the baseboard. She was cleaning. "Baby, I thought you were playing in the kitchen room." "I saw the man," Lily said simply. Rosa's hand stilled. "Which man, sweetheart?" "The tired man," Lily said, with the serene certainty of someone who has identified something obvious. "Upstairs. He was sitting on the steps. He looked like when I'm sad." Rosa set down her cloth slowly and stood. Her heart was doing something complicated. "Did you talk to him?" "I showed him my rock," Lily said, holding it up for illustration. "He said it was nice." Rosa was already moving, gently, toward the grand staircase, telling herself she was only checking, only making sure Lily hadn't bothered him, that this was simple parental oversight and nothing more. What she found stopped her at the base of the stairs. Ethan Harrington was sitting on the 4th step from the bottom, in his expensive clothes, with her 3-year-old daughter seated beside him, examining his right hand with the grave scientific interest that toddlers brought to everything that captured their attention. He was letting her. He was watching her small fingers gently touch his trembling hand with an expression on his face that Rosa had never seen there before. Something cracked open, something undefended and raw and almost unbearably human. He looked up when he sensed Rosa's presence. She opened her mouth to apologize, to gather Lily, to restore the invisible wall between their worlds. He shook his head slightly, slowly, and something in his expression asked her not to. So Rosa Mendez stood at the bottom of the stairs in the home of a billionaire, watching her daughter hold a sick man's hand, and she felt something shift in the air around all three of them, something that had no name in either English or Spanish, something that existed in the language that preceded language, the one that all humans are born knowing before the world teaches them to forget it. The Harrington estate had a particular quality of silence in its mid-morning hours, after the household staff had settled into their tasks and before the afternoon machinery of Ethan's professional life began to grind. It was in this silence that Lily Mendez decided, with complete 3-year-old authority, that she was not going back to the kitchen room. Rosa had gently guided her back twice. Both times, Lily had redirected herself toward the staircase with the quiet persistence that only small children and deeply determined adults possess, the kind that doesn't argue, doesn't negotiate, simply reorients and continues, as if the original destination was never in question. The third time, Rosa had looked up from the hallway floor to find Lily already gone. She found her again on the grand staircase, but this time Lily had climbed higher, to the landing on the second floor where a wide window overlooked the garden, and where Ethan was sitting in a high-backed chair that Rosa had always thought seemed oddly placed, as if someone had moved it from a room and forgotten to return it, or perhaps had placed it there deliberately, as a perch for watching the world below without being part of it. Ethan was on the phone. Or had been. Rosa could see from the doorway that his phone was now resting on his knee. The call apparently ended, and he was staring at the garden with the particular blankness of a man who has just received news he already knew was coming but had not quite finished hoping otherwise. Lily was standing 3 feet in front of him, her purple hood pushed back, her rock in her fist, studying him. Rosa hovered at the edge of the landing, caught between the impulse to intervene and something else, some instinct she couldn't fully name that told her to wait, to watch, to let whatever this was complete itself. "You're sick," Lily said. Not a question. A statement, delivered with the matter-of-fact compassion that very young children apply to observed reality before anyone has taught them that some truths are impolite to speak aloud. Ethan looked at her. Something moved across his face, surprise, then something softer. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I am. Does it hurt?" "Sometimes," he said. Lily considered this with appropriate gravity. She took a small step forward. "My mama gets headaches," she offered, with the conversational generosity of someone sharing something of value. "She presses here." Lily touched her own temple with one finger. "And drinks the water." "That's good advice," Ethan said, and something almost like a smile arrived at the corner of his mouth for the first time in what Rosa thought might genuinely be months. Lily tilted her head. This was a gesture Rosa knew intimately. It was what Lily did when she was arriving at something, when the thoughts inside her small head were organizing themselves into a shape that could exit through words. Rosa felt her own breath slow. "What do you drink?" Lily asked. Ethan blinked. "I'm sorry." "Water. Do you drink the water?" Yes," he said. "Of course." Lily looked unconvinced in the specific way that toddlers look unconvinced, with her entire face. "Which water?" There was a pause. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. But Rosa, watching from the doorway, saw something happen in those 4 seconds that she would spend years afterward trying to find adequate words for. She saw Ethan Harrington, the man who had consulted 31 of the world's finest physicians, who had undergone procedures that had no common names, who had sat in consultation rooms in 4 countries and heard 31 variations of "we cannot find the cause." She saw him go completely still. Not the stillness of dismissal. Not the stillness of politely waiting for a child to finish speaking so an adult could redirect the conversation. The stillness of a man who has just heard something land. "Which water?" he repeated softly, to himself more than to Lily. Lily nodded earnestly, as if he was catching on. "Mama says not all water is good water. She says some water has stuff in it. Bad stuff." She paused. "She says we use the Brita." In the doorway, Rosa felt heat climb her face. embarrassed suddenly, irrationally, as if her daughter had said something wrong, as if this domestic detail from their small apartment in Bridgeport was somehow inappropriate in these grand halls. She almost stepped forward. She almost said, "Lily, sweetheart, let's go." But Ethan was no longer looking at Lily. He was looking at the window, at the garden, at nothing and everything simultaneously, with the expression of someone watching the last piece of a puzzle fall into place from a great height, watching it fall and finally, after 14 months of falling, land. His right hand, resting on his knee, was trembling. And Rosa Mendez understood, in the particular way that mothers who pay attention understand things, that her daughter had just asked the question that 31 doctors hadn't thought to ask. Not because those doctors were incompetent, they were brilliant, all of them, their walls covered in credentials from the finest institutions in the world. But because they had all walked into rooms with Ethan Harrington already knowing what they were looking for, already working from frameworks built over careers of examining extraordinary pathology. Not one of them had started from the place a 3-year-old starts from, the unguarded beginning, the simplest human question: what do you put in your body every single day? Rosa didn't know what the answer was yet. She didn't know what Ethan had figured out in those 4 still seconds. She didn't understand what connection he was making, what door Lily's impossible simple question had opened in the sealed room of his medical mystery. But she knew, with a certainty that bypassed reasoning entirely and lived somewhere closer to the bone, that something had just changed. Lily, for her part, seemed satisfied. She walked forward and placed her smooth gray rock on the armrest of Ethan's chair with the ceremonial gravity of someone leaving an offering. "You can have this," she said. "It's lucky. I checked." Ethan looked down at the rock. He looked at it for a long moment. When he looked back up, his eyes were bright with something that might have been the beginning of tears, and Rosa thought it was probably the bravest thing she had ever seen a powerful man allow himself to almost feel in front of strangers. "Thank you, Lily," he said. And his voice just slightly broke. The investigation that followed Lily's question took 72 hours. Ethan launched it with the focused ferocity of a man who had been given, after 14 months of helpless waiting, something concrete to pursue. The Harrington estate used a sophisticated private water filtration system installed 12 years earlier by his father. It was state-of-the-art, or had been at installation. It was maintained quarterly by a contracted service company, or was supposed to be. When Ethan's team pulled the maintenance records, they found something that made his chief of household operations go pale. The last documented service visit had occurred 16 months ago. The company had changed ownership. The communication had fallen through the gaps of transition. The system had been quietly failing for over a year. But that was only the beginning. The filtration system was designed to process water from the estate's private well, another detail Ethan had inherited without particularly examining, the kind of background infrastructure that ran invisibly beneath the life of an estate this size. When the water from that well was independently tested for the first time in 7 years, the results arrived with the weight of revelation. The well casing had developed a crack. Trace minerals, including elevated levels of manganese and copper, leaching from corroded pipes that ran beneath the oldest part of the estate, had been accumulating in the water supply. Unfiltered, undetected, for 16 months. Manganese toxicity. The words landed in Ethan's chest with the particular resonance of things that are simultaneously devastating and illuminating. He researched it himself that night, sitting alone in his study with his trembling hand braced against the desk, reading with the hunger of a man granted access to a truth that had been locked from him for over a year. Chronic manganese poisoning, manganism, presented with symptoms that mimicked early Parkinson's disease: tremors, muscle rigidity, fatigue, cognitive disturbances, gait abnormalities, mood changes, headaches. It was rare enough that physicians who weren't specifically testing for it would not find it in standard panels. And none of 31 doctors, walking into a billionaire's consultation room, had thought to ask what is in your water. But a 3-year-old girl from Bridgeport, armed with nothing but her mother's practical wisdom about clean water and the pure, unfiltered logic of a child who had not yet learned which questions were too small to ask, had aimed her unknowing arrow exactly at the center of the target. Ethan sat in his study at 2 a.m, the gray rock on his desk in front of him, and he let himself cry. Not the controlled, managed emotion of a man practiced at maintaining composure. Real tears, the kind that come from a place beyond strategy, from the place where 14 months of fear and helplessness and forced stoicism had been quietly accumulating like minerals in water. He wept for the time lost, for the 31 consultations and the thousands of miles traveled and the procedures endured, for the way the fear had nested inside him and changed things, the way he had started looking at his life as if measuring what remained rather than what was possible, for the phone calls he had made in low voices to his estate attorney about updated provisions, for the board meetings where he had sat with trembling hands hidden beneath the conference table and delivered performance with the precision of someone who had learned to act well when feeling nothing like himself. And then, because Ethan Harrington had not built a life and a legacy by staying in any one feeling for too long, he dried his face, picked up the gray rock, and began making calls. The treatment for manganese toxicity, once identified, was not simple or instantaneous. The body does not release what it has accumulated overnight, and the neurological symptoms required careful, monitored management. But it was treatable. It was absolutely, definitively, medically treatable. There was a pathway forward that all 31 doctors would have seen clearly if they had been walking the same road Ethan had been walking every day for 16 months. Through the water he drank every morning, the ice he put in his evening glass, the water he used to swallow, every medication that had never been targeting the actual cause. The estate's water system was overhauled within a week. A specialist in metal toxicity and occupational medicine, a field that had simply never occurred to anyone because nobody had thought of Ethan Harrington in the context of environmental exposure, was engaged, and the treatment protocol began. The process would take months. The improvements would be gradual, then noticeable, then remarkable. But in the first week, even before any measurable physiological change, something shifted in Ethan that was not medical, but was perhaps equally significant. He began sleeping differently. Not better, not yet, but differently, with the particular quality of rest that arrives when a specific terror has been named and therefore diminished. The not knowing had been its own illness, running beneath the physical one, and the knowing, even knowing something difficult, had begun to treat it. He found himself, on the 4th day after the discovery, standing in the hallway outside the sitting room where Lily had been playing when she'd first encountered him. He stood there for a moment, looking at the small handprint Lily had apparently left on the lower portion of the window pane, a perfect small ghost of a hand, pressed against the glass in passing, overlooked by whoever had cleaned the room last because it was below the natural line of sight. He told Margaret to leave it. Margaret, who had worked for the Harrington family for 31 years and prided herself on running an immaculate household, looked at him for a long moment and then said, with perfect composure, "Of course, Mr. Harrington." The handprint stayed on the glass for 3 months. Every time Ethan walked past it, something happened in his chest that he eventually stopped trying to categorize or explain. It was simply there, and it was simply what it was, evidence of a small person who had moved through his world with complete naturalness and changed it irrevocably, leaving nothing behind but a ghost of a hand and a lucky gray rock and the most important question anyone had ever asked him. Rosa heard about the discovery from Margaret, who had called her on a Wednesday evening in November to relay what Mr. Harrington had asked Margaret to share, that the doctors had found what was wrong, that it had to do with the water, and that Rosa's daughter was. Margaret had paused here, as if searching for the right word, and Rosa had heard her voice carry something unexpected, something almost undone. Instrumental. Rosa had sat down on her kitchen floor. She wasn't sure why she sat on the floor specifically, only that the chair hadn't seemed sufficient. She sat with her back against the cabinet and Lily in her lap, watching her daughter fit smooth rocks together in a pattern on the linoleum, and she had allowed herself 5 minutes of feeling everything she was feeling without trying to organize it into words. She thought about what Lily had said on the drive home that day, matter-of-factly, already moving on to the next thing. The tired man has bad water, Mama. Like the old pipes at Abuela's. Rosa had agreed distractedly, her mind on traffic, on dinner, on the list of things that occupied every square inch of a 28-year-old single mother's mental space. She had not understood what her daughter meant in the particular way that it needed to be understood. But Lily had been there, genuinely observing, genuinely connecting, applying the only framework she had, the household knowledge her mother had taught her without realizing she was teaching anything, the simple practical understanding that water could carry things it shouldn't, that not all water was good water, that this mattered. Children absorbed everything. Rosa had always known this in the abstract. Now she knew it in the specific, private, extraordinary way that changed a person permanently. 3 weeks after the discovery, Margaret called again. Mr. Harrington would like to speak with Rosa, if she was willing. He would like her and Lily to come for a visit, not a workday, Margaret specified carefully. A visit? Rosa had stood in her kitchen for a long moment after that call, looking at Lily's latest rock collection arranged along the windowsill. Then she had said yes. She had dressed carefully without overdressing, understanding the delicate calibration the situation required. She had dressed Lily in her purple bear coat, because Lily insisted, and had braided her hair while Lily sat very still and held 2 rocks in each fist for ballast. The estate looked different on a Saturday. Softer somehow, or perhaps Rosa was seeing it differently. Not as a workplace requiring her professional invisibility, but as a place she was arriving at with her whole self intact. Margaret met them at the front door, not the service entrance, and that detail sat quietly in Rosa's chest like something she was still deciding what to do with. Ethan was in the garden. He looked different. Not recovered. She understood enough to know that recovery was a long road, but different in a way that was hard to name. Less sealed, perhaps. As if something that had been held under enormous pressure had been gently, carefully released. He was sitting in a garden chair in the thin autumn sun with a cup of something warm in his hands, and when he saw them come through the glass doors, he stood. He looked at Lily first. Lily looked at him with a frank assessment of someone checking on a project. "Are you less tired?" she asked. He crouched down to her level, a gesture Rosa noted without meaning to, the deliberate physical choice to not tower, to meet rather than address from above. "A little bit," he said. "Getting better." Lily nodded approvingly. "You should drink the good water," she said. "I know," he said, and his voice carried a weight that transformed the simple words into something else entirely. "You told me." He had prepared something, Rosa could see. There was a small table set up in the sheltered corner of the garden, with hot chocolate for Lily and coffee for Rosa, and tea for himself, and on the table were 2 envelopes. Rosa noticed them, and felt the specific preemptive discomfort of a person about to receive something they don't know how to accept. But it wasn't what she expected. Ethan explained, his hands wrapped around his tea, speaking simply and directly in the way she had always appreciated about him, that he had wanted to do something that went beyond what could be captured in a check. He had established a college fund for Lily, fully funded, index-linked, transferable to any accredited institution in the United States. He had also established a fund for Rosa herself, a financial independence account designed specifically to give her the runway, the breathing room, the options that single mothers working hourly jobs in other people's homes so rarely had access to. And he had made a donation in their names, Rosa's and Lily's, to a nonprofit that installed clean water filtration systems in underserved communities across Connecticut. Because Lily's mother had known that not all water was good water, and had taught her daughter this, and that knowledge had traveled from a small apartment in Bridgeport to a grand estate in Greenwich and saved a man's life. Rosa looked at the envelopes and felt something bloom and break open in her simultaneously. "I don't know how to accept this," she said, which was the honest thing. "You don't have to know how," Ethan said. You just have to let it be what it is. Which is the smallest possible thing I could think of that was still proportional to what your daughter gave me. Lily, at this moment, was crouched by the garden edge, examining something on the ground with complete absorption. She looked up, since she'd been mentioned, and held up a new rock, rounder than her other one, with a streak of white quartz through the center. Look, she said to no one in particular. Another lucky one. 14 months after Lily Mendez asked her question in the stairwell landing of the Harrington estate, Ethan stood at a podium in front of 300 physicians, researchers, and medical professionals at a symposium on diagnostic medicine in Boston. He had been asked to speak about his case, carefully anonymized in the medical literature, though anyone in certain circles knew whose story it was, as an example of diagnostic failure patterns in high-resource patients. He had agreed, on one condition, that he be allowed to tell the full story. He stood at the podium in a suit that fit him the way his suits had always fit before the illness, his hands still now. The treatment had progressed well, the tremors largely resolved, the fatigue lifted, the man who had lived inside the deteriorating body gradually re-inhabiting it with something that felt like gratitude at a cellular level. He looked out at 300 faces representing the combined might of Western medicine, and he said, I want to tell you about a 3-year-old named Lily. He told them everything. The 14 months, the 31 physicians, the procedures and the panels and the consultations. The growing, quiet terror of being a man with every resource in the world and no way to use any of it against the specific invisible thing consuming him. And then he told them about a morning in November, and a child in a purple bear coat who had climbed his stairs uninvited and sat beside him and asked which water he drank. The room was very quiet. Not one of you, he said, and his voice was careful and measured, holding no accusation, only wonder, asked me that question. Not one. 31 brilliant, credentialed, deeply skilled physicians walked into consultation rooms with me and began, immediately, from complexity, which is what your training prepares you to do, which is what expertise in some ways demands. You begin from what you know, from the frameworks you've built, from the patterns that have been confirmed across careers. And that is a strength. In most cases, it's exactly right. He paused. But sometimes, he said, the answer is in the simplest place. The place that expertise walks past because it seems too obvious, too domestic, too far outside the architecture of sophisticated diagnosis. A child doesn't have that architecture. A child begins from the only place she knows. What do you put in your body every day? Which is, as it turns out, the question that could have saved me 16 months of deterioration and 31 consultations, and more fear than I know how to put into words. He looked down at the podium for a moment. When he looked up, his composure was intact, but only just. I am telling you this not to criticize medicine, he said. I am telling you this because I believe the most sophisticated thing any of us can do is remain capable of the simple question. Of the beginner's question. Of the question a child asks before she knows which questions are too small to matter. He reached into his jacket pocket and set something on the podium in front of him. A small, smooth gray rock with a streak of white quartz. Lily had given him a second one the day of their garden visit, presented with the same ceremonial gravity as the first. A little girl gave me this, he said, and told me it was lucky. She checked. Something moved across his face, the particular expression of a man who has been made better by the world and knows it, and has not yet finished being astonished by that fact. I am inclined to agree with her assessment. 300 physicians gave him a standing ovation. Rosa heard about the speech later, from Margaret, who sent her a recording. She watched it on her phone in her kitchen after Lily was asleep. Sitting in the same spot on the floor where she had sat the night, she first heard that they had found what was wrong with the tired man. She watched Ethan set the rock on the podium, and she watched his face in that moment, and she pressed her hand over her mouth and breathed through everything she was feeling. Then she got up, went to Lily's room, and stood in the doorway watching her daughter sleep, arms flung wide in the absolute abandon of a child who has never learned to be afraid of taking up space, mouth slightly open, her latest rock collection lined up on the windowsill catching the streetlight from outside. Rosa thought about all the things she had taught her daughter without knowing she was teaching anything. She thought about clean water and Abuela's old pipes and the Brita filter and the thousand small practical wisdoms of a life lived carefully with limited resources, where you learned which things mattered because you couldn't afford to ignore them. She thought about what it meant that her daughter had carried that knowledge, her knowledge, Rosa's knowledge, the knowledge of women who cleaned other people's houses and knew how the world actually worked from the ground up, into a grand estate in Greenwich and laid it at the feet of a man who had every advantage in the world and needed precisely that one thing she had to give. She thought about invisible labor and visible outcomes, about the knowledge that lives in the bodies and habits and everyday wisdoms of ordinary people, knowledge that doesn't have a credential attached to it, knowledge that doesn't appear in any framework or panel or consultation, knowledge that a brilliant 3-year-old can carry in her fist alongside a lucky rock and deliver, without ceremony, to the exact person who needs it most. And she thought about what Ethan had said to her in the garden that day when she had told him she didn't know how to accept what he was offering. You just have to let it be what it is. What it was, Rosa decided, watching her daughter sleep in the orange-tinted dark, was this: the world running the way it was supposed to. People helping people. Knowledge moving freely across the walls that money and class and credential try to build between human beings. A child who had not yet learned those walls existed, walking straight through them with a rock in her fist and a simple, honest question on her tongue, and changing everything. Lily stirred, sighed, pulled her blanket without waking. Rosa leaned against the doorframe and let everything she was feeling be exactly what it was. Outside, the Connecticut night was cold and clear, the kind of night where you could see more stars than the city usually allowed. Somewhere across the distance, in a renovated estate with clean water running through every pipe, a man who had been slowly losing himself was slowly being returned to himself, sleeping more soundly than he had in 14 months, a gray rock on his nightstand, a debt he would spend years trying to approximate in the language of action and generosity, knowing it would never quite be sufficient, and being grateful for that, too. Being grateful that some things exceeded the reach of reimbursement. Being grateful that a 3-year-old had taught him, among everything else, that the most important things tend to. The lucky rock had checked out. Some wisdom comes dressed in a bare coat, carrying stones. And sometimes the question that saves a life is the smallest one in a room. For every invisible hand that keeps the world running. For every mother who teaches without knowing she is teaching. For every child who asks the question that needed asking. And for the wisdom that lives not in credentials, but in paying attention.